Welcome back to the Cheap Heat Productions podcast. Okay, welcome back to the show. And today I'm joined by Mr. Brian R. Solomon. He's a writer, he used to work with the WWE as well in the magazine and publishing section there. He also has a podcast on the Jim Cornette Network. Brian, how are you?
I'm doing great, Maurice. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
No problem, man. So, look, what I always do is because you're involved in the wrestling world, and I know you have books that are not wrestling as well, but I want to know about how you became interested and then subsequently involved in the wrestling world.
Well, I've been a fan since I was a child. I started watching the WWF when I was 12 years old, which was about the time of WrestleMania 3. So it was that whole build with Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan. That kind of hooked me as a fan. As I got a little older in the 90s, kind of like when I was in high school and college, I started getting interested in the historical stuff. Initially because of wrestling magazines, which was all we had back then. And then when the internet started going, like in the mid 90s, it was like this explosion of information. For other people, they were looking up information about important things. I was trying to learn as much as I could about the history of pro wrestling. So in college, I had a wrestling column in the college paper. I used to cover the neighborhood indie shows in Brooklyn, New York for the local neighborhood newspapers, shoot my own pictures and everything. I started sending clippings around to magazines, wrestling magazines. At the time, it would be like the Apter magazines and WWF magazine, which was Vince Russo at the time, George Napolitano's magazines, all the different people that I thought might be interested. I was a little naive. I didn't know how it all worked or like how it paid or didn't pay.
Yeah.
And it led nowhere. So after college, I wound up I knew I wanted to write. I was interested in writing. I was an English major. I got into professional writing, non-wrestling, academic stuff in the beginning. And then I was looking to make a little more money, and I was getting married, and I found WWE or WWF at the time was looking for a copy editor. I found their ad in the classified section of the New York Times, and I responded. They put me through the mill for a while. I went on several interviews. I couldn't even believe I got called in for one. But between October 99 and January 2000, I went on 3 different interviews there. They were looking for a copy editor, which is like a glorified proofreader, initially in their creative services department, but then publications department, which is really where I landed. And I started there in February 2000, and that was the beginning of professionally working in and around the wrestling industry. Because for 7 years I was a writer. I was a writer and an editor on WWE's various magazines and publications, and also .com a little bit too. And ever since then, I've been doing other things, either on a part-time side basis with wrestling and magazines and books. And more recently, it's really become more of a full-time thing. It's taken up so much of my time lately with the books that I've been doing and the magazines I've been contributing to. So it's been a fun ride.
How did it feel going into a world like that as a fan? And did it have any positive and negative benefits?
Well, it initially felt impossible. Like I couldn't imagine that it was real. Like I've told people, it felt like the screenplay of a movie. Because it's one thing to go to work for WWE, but for someone like me, for everyone that knew me and they knew that I like breathed and lived wrestling, it's all I ever wanted to talk about. And I was already becoming this encyclopedia, just insufferable to be around about wrestling. that
Yeah.
somebody like me would wind up working there. It was like too impossible to believe. I remember when I first started, I would make the commute from New York City, which is like, a 2-hour drive up to Stamford, Connecticut. And I would be the happiest man alive going in there, I mean, not that I was, later was miserable or anything, but, a job becomes a job. But for the first couple of years, I would be pulling in off the highway. I'd see Titan Tower with the big flag, and I would just be laughing, like actually laughing at the good fortune that I had and just the ridiculousness of that I would wind up there. So I mean, I enjoyed the hell out of it, and it got a little rocky in the later years. I think everybody has that experience working there. It has its ups and downs, but I had a blast. It was the most fun job I've ever had. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It spoiled me for any other job.
Yeah. What way did your role there change over time then?
Well, when I started, I kind of had to bluff my way in, to be honest, because I wanted
Yeah.
in there. And they were looking for a proofreader. Now, I had never done officially that kind of work. I had just been writing. I worked for a
Yeah.
company called H.W. Wilson, which was a reference book publisher, and I was writing biographical articles for them. And, the only experience I had with proofreading was the people that would proofread my stuff. So I had learned a little bit about the proofreader's marks, and because back then a lot of it was still on paper. We would like
Yeah.
mark it up and everything. And so I kind of bluffed my way in, and what happened was I started doing that kind of work. But about 9 months in, when they started seeing how much I knew about the stuff and that I could actually write, because I would jump in now and then and do things, they had a writer opening. There was a writer, Robert Bledsoe, who left the company, and Barry Warner, the publisher of the magazines, slotted me in there. He recognized that. I think he felt like I was kind of being wasted doing that kind of work. I'm like proofreading, t-shirts and ring aprons and things. And he said, let's have this kid write for us instead. And that kind of got me off to the races, because, for a couple of years I was strictly a writer, staff writer, senior staff writer. Then when we had one of our managing editors leave, Mike Fazioli, who was running Raw Magazine and WWE Magazine, I wound up getting one of those. I was the manager of WWE Magazine, which then turned into SmackDown Magazine. So I've then had various editorial roles. As a managing editor, at least the way it worked at WWE. I mean, technically, a managing editor's job is you're running the traffic. You're making sure the writers are submitting work, the editors are getting the articles, the photography people know what pictures they're pulling. It's like you're managing all that. But at WWE, it was actually even more of an authority role. I don't know if it was because they didn't want to do it themselves, but the managing editors
Yeah.
ran the day-to-day magazine. They would have input on what was going to go in. It was almost like the equivalent of an editor in chief, even though I reported to the publisher. So, I mean, there was a lot of freedom there. SmackDown magazine in particular was my baby. I mean, like, I decided what went in there every month. It was my thing. So later on, when the magazines changed, when they became more of the men's lifestyle version of WWE Magazine, which happened 2006, for like my last year and a half there, it kind of, the structure of it changed a little bit. It became more like, like a real magazine, like a New York run magazine. We had much more structure, much more infrastructure. And so I was not the boss anymore of the magazine. I was more part of an editorial team. I was what they called a senior editor, where there were portions of the magazine that I was kind of in charge of, and I would still get to write articles, but we had a lot more kind of layers when that happened. But I mean, I've done it all basically in the editorial sense at that company. So it got me a lot of experience. I'm very grateful for it.
Is the magazine still in publication? Like I don't see them over here anymore in Ireland. We used to see them all the time.
No, it died in 2014, and I left in 2007. So I mean, I can't honestly say that the new crew that they brought in killed the magazine. I mean, because they ran it for a good 8 years. I mean, it wound up bleeding a lot of money, whereas when I was there, it was profitable. But
Yeah.
I don't think that was the main reason they pulled the plug. I think it was just an industry wide thing. Magazines were going away, and I'm not, not fully. I still write for wrestling magazines now, but
Yeah.
WWE no longer was willing, I think, to invest in the time and resources to put out print magazines. Now, they could have just gone with a digital only magazine like some people have done. They chose not to do that. What they chose to do in 2014 was instead put all their resources into the website,
Yeah.
WWE.com, and social media presence, which they became like one of the pioneers of mobile presence, things like that. They really shifted their gears, and the magazines were seen as dinosaurs, and they kind of just put them out to pasture.
Yeah. You were talking earlier about facts and figures and things like that. I do have one of your books. It's somewhere in this house, but I don't know where it is. Like I haven't seen it in years, but I know it's like in a box somewhere from when we moved last time. But you were talking about your interests in, we'll say, dates, facts, figures, things like that. How influential were you on that magazine, and was that your idea even?
Well, that was a book. That was a whole trivia
Yeah.
book that
Sorry, a
we
book.
did,
Yeah.
and it was that was in the days when WWE had a deal with Simon and Schuster, and the deal was that they were putting out a book every month. So like everybody knows about the McFoley books and The Rock and China and the books that were coming out, that were the big New York Times bestsellers, but that wasn't every month. So, I there were a few of us that were like wrestling trivia buffs. You see Kevin Kelly's name is on there. There was
Yeah.
Aaron Feigenbaum, who was also known as Aaron Williams, who wrote on the magazine with me. There was Phil Spear, who was a writer for WWE.com. And we had this idea to do a trivia book. I mean, I had been doing trivia in the magazine for a couple of years. That was kind of my thing. And so we just thought, hey, this is an easy book to get out for a particular month. That's really all it was. And I volunteered to get the old school section. Like they broke it down, and I said, give me the real old stuff. Like I'll handle like 60s, 70s. Like I want that real old school stuff, like pre WrestleMania. That's what I'm interested in. And they did. They gave me, and I did a little more than that too. But I remember I had that version, and there was a version in Japanese, which I was blown away by. I don't think I still have it, but there was a Japanese version. It's a fun book, but like today, if you get it now, it's like 19 years old, I think. A lot of it is outdated. Like it's nice to have as a collector's item if you're a completist and all that. But a lot of the trivia is obsolete because the facts change, the records change, and some of it is no longer accurate. But it's still a fun book.
Yeah. Did you ever get to meet the boss in your time there, Vince?
Oh God, yes. I was around him quite a bit. I worked for Shane. Shane for many years that I was there was the person running our department, the top person, among other departments. And so when you work for him, you have access to Vince. So yeah, there would certainly be times when I would be around Vince over the years that I was there, more than you would think. I mean, more than the typical nobody like myself would have experienced working there. I was in these kind of crazy circles sometimes. Like I rode in a limousine with him. I'd be in boardrooms with him. I'd have to pitch ideas to him, like even just conversations when the meeting's over and it's just me and him and like my boss. And we're just sitting there just talking about stuff. Like I've had those experiences, certainly.
Y- Is there any kind of story or moment that stands out from
Yeah.
talking to him?
Well,
Because
I've
everyone's got their own unique one, you know?
Right. I've told these stories about 759 times, so I don't know if you've ever heard any of them or if you have a greatest hits request, but there were many, many times. That everybody loves the story about when he told me to take my head out of Dave Meltzer's ass. That's kind of a favorite. In fact, I'm going to be on Wrestling Observer Live soon, and I think maybe even Friday, but I don't think I've ever personally told Dave that story. I may bring it up when I'm on there, but we were in a board meeting and we used to have the opportunity. I don't know if you'd call it an opportunity. I'd call it, the plight of having to pitch magazine ideas to him. Why? I don't know. He's the chairman of the company, but I think Shane took like sadistic glee in bringing us up there to pitch to him. And so there was an issue where I'm pitching, for various kinds of ideas. And at one point, he starts to pretend like he's falling asleep, in front of the board members. Just I'm telling him we're going to be doing an interview with Booker T. Not a big fan of that idea. Sorry, Booker T. And I think what really set him off, and it was not what I would have expected, was we wanted to do a magazine on an article on the greatest steel cage matches. And I guess, Vince doesn't typically like that. He sees that as Meltzer thinking, like ranking matches, like for him, and he said this to me even directly, like it's not the match that's so important. I mean, obviously he wants people that can have good matches. He doesn't want like he will chew you out if your match sucked. I mean, everybody knows the story. I think it was Rhino and Tajiri or somebody where he came out to the ring on television. I think it was a taping, and was like, nope, forget it. Go to the back. You're done. Like in the middle of the match. So, I mean, like he
Wow.
cares about match quality, but for him, the storyline is paramount. And so, like, he doesn't like the way that Meltzer will take a match and like surgically remove it from the angle and just study it by itself, like this match, without the context. For him, the context is everything. Like when he told me that he thought, and look, I understand him more now, that he thought that, Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant WrestleMania 3 was the best match. It was better than Savage and Steamboat. And, because of everybody always saying that Savage and Steamboat was the best match. Because that was the match, Hogan and Andre was the match everybody wanted to see. It was this angle that got everybody excited. It was the colossal, confrontation of legends. That's the way he looks at things. So he
Yeah.
hates this idea of like studying matches like that. And so we wanted to do the greatest steel cage matches ever. And he goes, boy, you guys really need to take your heads out of Dave Meltzer's ass. And, I'm terrified, of course. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm like, I don't know, 30 years old, whatever it is. I'm just trying to feed my kids and this, crazy billionaire and his whims. But, there would be other times where he would be totally agreeable and nice and warm, talk to me about his family, his kids, his father, tell me these stories about when he was a kid and the things that he saw. I remember he told me once that, he started traveling around with his dad as a teenager, in like the 60s or even late 50s. And he remembered being at Comiskey Park in Chicago in 1961, the night that Buddy Rogers won the NWA title from Pat O'Connor, which was like one of those gigantic, early super cards. And he was there with his dad. He was like 16 years old. Like these are things that he would just throw off randomly, like these amazing anecdotes. So it would be cool to be around him sometimes.
Yeah. And then there's the other
Right.
side as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
then you get the Mr. McMahon side, which exists. I've seen things that I wouldn't always I'm not even going to say here, but I've seen things where it's like, oh wow, that's the character from television. I've definitely I've seen it. It's real. It's a real part of him, but it's only part of him.
Yeah. Yeah. Your latest book, it came out in April, Blood and Fire, the
There it
original
is.
Sheik. How is it going for you? Are you happy with it? See, there's great reviews online for it.
It's been great. I mean, I've been really pleasantly surprised. I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I wanted to do it as a passion project. It was like a labor of love. It was a legend, a very important figure in the business, maybe the greatest heel of all time, and somebody who had never gotten the book treatment and was likely never to get it. And I just thought, well, I want to do something about this. But then I thought, well, it's not going to really do that well. It'll be great for history buffs, but I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care, whatever. They're paying me in advance, and maybe it won't, because I had done a book before called Pro Wrestling FAQ, which I put a lot of heart into, and it didn't sell the greatest. And I think it was because it was more just a general reference book. And I think sometimes that has a harder time finding a readership among wrestling fans. They like personality driven books. So that's partly why I did it. But it just started picking up momentum. And I think it was because I haven't shut up about it for the past 3 years. So I've been all over social media pushing it. And then the turning point came with Jim Cornette. I mean, when it got into Jim Cornette's hands, which I thank Brian Last for, his producer for making that happen and helping to facilitate that, because I just had a feeling that it would be something he would go for. And I know I took a chance, because if he hated it, he might have gone on the air and just completely destroyed it and me. But he didn't. He loved the book. I thought, he's somebody that has a great interest in wrestling history, just fascinated by it. And I think he actually found the book very educational, which I was humbled by, if I could educate somebody like that. So, I mean, that was the turning point. I think once that happened and I was on his show too in February, it was like an explosion of interest. I couldn't believe it. Like the level, it was to the point where when it finally came out on Amazon, they sold out on the day of. So, which was
Wow.
a good problem to have, but it was a little frustrating because it took a couple of weeks for them to restock, and people were losing their minds. Like they couldn't figure out how to get it. And I was selling autographed copies, which I still am, but I mean, like, I was like shipping out more than I can even handle because people were like, well, can I just buy it from you? And, that kind of thing. And so Amazon was absolutely not ready for the level of demand for this book. Not at all. And understandably, they thought it was going to be some niche little thing of a forgotten legend of wrestling. And, they didn't they didn't pre-order nearly enough. And they were honestly a little slow to act. I mean, you would have think they would have responded. ECW Press, I talked to them about it, and they can only do so much because they can't ship out books if there's not an order, right? So Amazon has to make the move. And then they finally
Order from
woke
them.
up.
Yeah.
Right. They finally woke up. And now, I mean, it's widely available. And we were number one on Amazon for wrestling books for a little while there, which means we beat the John Moxley book, which was unbelievable. He's back up there. But I mean, I had my moment in the sun there where it was number one. And just, I never could have thought that would happen. So I'm glad. I'm really glad.
Yeah, I was watching you on another podcast recently, and you were saying that when you're writing a wrestling book, you want to write it in a way that I can bring in maybe someone that's not a wrestling fan and that can enjoy it as well. Do you want to talk to me about that process and trying to get the balance right?
Yeah, there were two parts of that really. I wanted it to appeal to people who maybe were wrestling, you have your three groups. You have your people that they love the Sheik, they're fanatical old school fans, they remember the Sheik. That's great. And I'm very pleased to write something that would bring their memories back. But you also had the wrestling fans who maybe don't know anything about the Sheik, who are young or weren't aware. Maybe the only Sheik they know is the Iron Sheik. And I was hoping that those people would have the open mind and say, I want to learn more about this person. I didn't really know who he was. I want to learn. And that has happened. I keep hearing those stories. And then there's the group you mentioned. And I really hope it's hard to tell because, I do a lot of wrestling podcasts and things, but I don't do a lot of, you know, media that's not wrestling related. So I'm curious myself because my goal is also people, as a writer, I just want to write a great book. I want to write a book that has a good story, a good narrative, a good theme. It's not just, a dry kind of list of things that happen. And so for that, I really want people to have an open mind. Like if you're interested in the history of show business, if you're interested in sports biographies, if you're interested in just 20th century American pop culture, give the book a shot, and I think you might get pulled in by it because there's so much context that I tried to pack in there. So it's not just the story of a wrestler. It's a bigger picture of, like I said, show business, how wrestling is a part of show business, how this person was a showman, how he fit into the cultural landscape of his time. There's a lot happening in this book. So, that's there for a reason to appeal to a wide array of readers.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, like I've talked to a lot of pro wrestlers on this podcast, and it's not just a wrestling podcast. I'd have people from TV, movies, and different things like that. So when I have someone on from the wrestling business, they expect me to hit them with this match in '99 or when you won this championship and stuff like that. But I try and pull all that away and just have a conversation with them that maybe a casual person can watch and enjoy as well. So it kind of reminds me of what you're saying there.
Yeah, it's a line that you walk, and I'm always thinking about it when I write any wrestling book in particular because you don't want to dumb it down to the point where people that know wrestling are going to be like, all right, God, I don't need this guy to explain to me every little thing. But then you have people that aren't going to know all the terminology. So you have to figure out how to do it, how to like elegantly or subtly explain certain things where the people that don't know what they are will get it, and the people that do know what they are will not be bored by over explanation. So it is a very fine and careful line, and you also have to know your audience. I know that there's groups of both kinds that are going to read this book. Like there's people that are big wrestling fans and maybe people that aren't. So I have to appeal to that. Like I know, sometimes if there's a wrestling book that's being written with a wide audience in mind and not a wrestling audience, like the new Vince McMahon book that's coming out, Ringmaster, which I've heard a lot about, and I'm friends with the author, Abraham Reisman, and he is writing for the layman. I know that from talking to him. So he's writing a book that is intended for people that don't necessarily follow wrestling but are curious about this Vince McMahon person. Now, That would be a very different kind of book than from a book that would be written for WWE fans that want to learn about Vince McMahon. You'd have to write a very different kind of book. So that's what I
Yeah.
mean. So with my book, it's kind of in the middle.
Yeah. So it's like a Vince McMahon book, and then the WWE version would be the Mr. McMahon book. That's probably the best way of
And I
describing it.
think he's shopping that book around, although I don't know if that's still going to happen, but he had been shopping that book around. We'll see.
Yeah. And then I see, like, on the flip side of things, aside from wrestling, you have a Godzilla FAQ book, which
Yes.
is nothing to do with wrestling at all. Do you want to tell me about that?
It has more to do with it than you would think, because
Oh, really?
there was crossover, especially in Japanese culture. The wrestling craze in Japan that happened in the 60s and 70s definitely affected Godzilla movies and kaiju movies in general. There was some of that that informed it. And you also have, even in America, there's Kaiju Big Battle, which is a whole indie wrestling league that is based on giant monster movies where
This is
wrestlers,
nothing this is absolutely nothing I knew about. I just
yeah,
thought about Godzilla stomping buildings and cars and
right.
stuff like
That's
that.
what I mean. There's so much crossover and interconnection. That book happened because I had done Pro Wrestling FAQ in 2015, and I said, look, let's do another one. Like, here's a list of, because it was a series, the FAQ series, and I said to the publisher, here's a list of other things that I know a lot about. I could do, a Star Wars FAQ. You want me to do, I don't know, I could do a Frank Sinatra FAQ. I don't know. I gave them like a whole list, and they went with Godzilla. And that took more work because I've always loved those movies, even from when I was a kid, but I wasn't as encyclopedic about them as I was about wrestling. And so I had to learn much more, and I had to do a lot more deep research. And that book has actually wound up becoming, although I don't know what the Chic numbers will be yet, that's the best selling book I ever did, which is
Wow.
hilarious to me because it's the non wrestling book. But again, it shows you the appeal that these pop culture things have. Like, I just finished my 5th book, which comes out next year, called Superheroes: The History of a Pop Culture Phenomenon from Ant-Man to Zorro. And it's the history of the superheroes subgenre of fiction, even beyond comic books, just the entire history of the concept of superheroes. And even though, again, wrestling is my great love, and every now and then I kind of deviate and I write something different, I have a feeling, because of the subject matter, I'm being very hopeful here, that book may wind up being the new best-selling book that I write, just because it's such a hot topic right now with all the movies and everything like that. So, I try to branch out. I'm going to jump back into the wrestling vein, though, now that I'm done with this book. I'm just not quite sure what the next one's going to be, but it will be something wrestling related.
Yeah. Speaking of wrestling related, Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the magazine that came out today. Do you want to talk to me about that?
Yeah. I got my copy today in the mail because I get my comp editions in the mail. It's not yet available in print form yet. In about 2 weeks, it'll be hitting newsstands and stores. It's the October issue, because magazines are a few months ahead. It's the
Yeah.
October 2022 issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. It has Thunder Rosa and Jade Cargill on the cover. The digital copies you can buy now. You can get them at PWI's website. You can buy it digitally. My story in there is a Cody Rhodes, Dusty Rhodes story, and it was supposed to be the cover, but he got injured. And so, conventional wisdom in wrestling magazines is, wrestler gets hurt, they're not going to be on TV. You don't put them on your cover, because people forget. And I'm not saying they're going to forget completely, but I mean, the impact is less when someone's not on TV every week. So I understand that. But I did a story when I heard Cody talking about this on TV, I first heard him in AEW saying it. And then when he came to WWE, and he talked about how they took the WWE title away from his dad in Madison Square Garden. And he's on a mission to reclaim that belt that his father could never win. He wanted to put it in his father's hands. He can't do that anymore, but he still wants to right that wrong. His father, who was a 3-time NWA world champion, was never able to win the WWF WWE World Heavyweight title. And so I thought, what a perfect story. It's wrestling, but it's based in quote unquote reality. And I want to tell this story. Go back to 1977, New York City, the son of Sam. the record-breaking heat in New York, the Yankees going to the World Series, like all this happening. Star Wars is out at the Astor Plaza Theater in Times Square, like big, and in Madison Square Garden, superstar Billy Graham is defending the heavyweight championship of the world against the most popular wrestler on the planet, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. Break down the match. What happened? He won by count out. He thought he was the new champ, right? He holds the belt up. They take it away. Then fast forward to Cody now, breaking into wrestling, growing up watching Hulk Hogan and Stone Cold Steve Austin and Randy Savage and thinking that's the title. Dad, did you ever win that title? No. Well, I have to win that title. There's a whole story there, and I jumped on it. I love those kind of things. And Kevin McElvaney, the editor-in-chief there, was kind enough to let me do it. And now that it's out, there's people. I know Cody himself thanked me for the story. So I mean, I was so excited by that and humbled by that. He tweeted about it. He kind of put it out there, and people have been talking about that. It's probably the most proud I've ever been of an article that I've been writing for PWI for 15 years, and this is my favorite article that I've done for them. I mean, this was like such a pleasure to write. The photography is great because Bill Apter, this was really a big reason why I wanted to do it. I knew they would have the pictures because they have everything. Bill Apter was ringside at the Garden in New York that night, and they have the photos from the match. So there's pictures from the match in the article. It's awesome. Like, I'm so excited about it.
And that story is going to come full circle, I reckon. Not as soon as we thought it would, but I see, like, outside of Roman Reigns, there seems to be, from me looking at it, there's no guy there. Cody was going to be that guy, I think.
Yeah, Roman right now is in a holding pattern. I understand that. If from a booking perspective, you need him to have opponents, but you got to figure out ways to keep it going. So that's why they're having him in tag matches with the Usos and things. And you've got people like Drew McIntyre, Randy Orton. Now Brock is back. People that he could have matches, good matches with, but are not going to beat him. Or at least, I mean, you don't think they're going to beat him. And yeah, Cody is that somebody on the horizon that you think is likely going to be the one to do it. We were a little worried even publishing the article thinking, okay, what if that's the SummerSlam match? Because this was a couple of months ago when I'm writing this thing. What if that's the SummerSlam match? And if it is the SummerSlam match, by the time this comes out in July, Cody will already be the champion, maybe. And the story will be obsolete. And then as it got a little closer and we started going, no, I think they're going to hold off a little on this match. I think they're going to either save it for next WrestleMania or maybe the Royal Rumble or something, because then we're thinking The Rock might be on the horizon at WrestleMania. But like I've said before, they don't need the title for that match. Roman could very conceivably lose the belt before then. That match is bigger than the title. Then you have WrestleMania. In WrestleMania, you've got almost like a double main event. You could have Rock versus Roman, and then you could have Cody versus anybody, maybe Brock for the title. Like you could have a conceivable double main event. And the more I think about it, the more I think that might actually be what happens. The only reasoning against that is if they want Roman to be unbeaten going into The Rock, making him as strong as possible going against The Rock. The only way to do it, if I do a tiny bit of fantasy booking, I know people hate when people do this, but if you have Rock somehow cost him the title, then you could build the heat and have the belt off of Roman and still have an interesting match, as long as you don't do it in a way that makes Cody look weak. Like even if The Rock were to just do one of those jobs where he just comes out and he's on the ramp, he doesn't even interfere, he just comes out, and Roman is so flustered that he loses the match, that would be enough, But I don't make these decisions,
I'm going to throw a little bit of fantasy booking your way.
Sure.
Kevin Owens is in the Royal Rumble. Ezekiel or Elias comes out, we'll say. Elias gets thrown over the top rope. And then Ezekiel comes out, or vice versa. Whichever way they can work the beard. Probably go with Ezekiel first at number 1 and number 2, and then Elias near the end. Like, I don't really know where they're going with this, but they have to take it to that moment in the Royal Rumble, I think.
I think that would be the smart thing to do. I hope that they do it. And now I know they have this new brother, Elrod, which I don't know if they've actually shown him on TV yet. I'm wondering. At first I thought it's going to be the same guy again with a different look, but from what I understand, it's actually a new wrestler that they're giving this character to. What I thought would have been fantastic, but it would have taken so much pre-planning, is if it turned out that they actually were twins. I mean, could you imagine if nobody knew that? I don't know what his real name is, but the wrestler who plays Elias, if he actually was a twin, I mean, that would be the most incredible thing ever. If it turned out that he was right the whole time, I mean, that, but
Yeah.
that's a 1 in a million if they could have pulled that off.
And they were also on about possibly bringing Damien Sandow back to play the Elias character, which could have worked, I guess.
He was teasing that a little bit because he's been wrestling for the NWA, and he recently had what he called a retirement match. It
Mhm.
almost seemed like they were half joking, though. I can't even tell if they're being serious or not. He may still be with the NWA, but then he was like deflecting rumors that he was going to be in
On Raw.
WWE, which I didn't even know there were those rumors until he addressed the rumors. So maybe he's trying to make something happen. I don't know, but
Yeah.
could be.
We want to talk about your Patreon and the podcast on there, Shut Up and Wrestle, what people could expect from that.
Sure. Actually, the Patreon is, which originally, when I had been toying with starting a podcast, I created a Patreon built around an interview that I did with the legendary wrestling manager Bobby Davis before he passed away. I was going to have the podcast be a Patreon podcast, but I decided against it because
Okay.
I was approached by Brian Last, and because I had been on his 605 Super podcast, I had been on the Jim Cornette Experience, and when I mentioned publicly that I wanted to start a podcast, he approached me to include it on the Arcadian Vanguard Network, which I thought was a no-brainer because I
Yeah.
mean, first of all, he's a great guy. We get along very well. We have a good rapport, and it's a built-in platform. I mean, I'd be stupid to say, well, because I was going to just do it from scratch. I wouldn't have presumed that he would have even been interested in having the show on there. I was but he was, and I thought, well, okay, I could start instead of like having to get a home run. I could start from second base and try to steal home. Different kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And he let me do that, and it's been great so far. It's been, it's finding an audience week by week, more and more. It's called Shut Up and Wrestle. It's an old school themed podcast, so we don't really talk about the current product on there. Not that I don't like it, but I just that my great love is old school wrestling, and I wanted that to be my focus. And the idea is I have a different guest every week, and they're typically people that I know or I'm acquainted with, I have a comfortable relationship with. So the idea is we're just having conversations, just our own conversations about wrestling, and I just happen to be recording it. It's very casual. It's very familiar. Like I said, it's all people that I know so far. So it's
Yeah.
been going well. I love it. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And you mentioned obviously that you're going to be releasing a new book. And I just want to know, have you got any other projects in the pipeline?
Well, wrestling wise, after the superheroes book, which we're now going to be in post production on for the next year, I have some ideas, but one is I've been thinking about doing something on the history of wrestling magazines, which no one's ever done before, like kind of like a pop culture art book, like a coffee table book, like they do with comic books and things like
Yeah.
that. And on the biography front, if that winds up being what I do, I have a few names in mind. I don't really want to say who, because if somebody
Yep.
decides to beat me to the punch. But I will say this: I have a couple of names in mind, and they're people that have never had a book done on them. That's another reason why I don't want to say, because then someone will be like, "Well, there's
Exactly.
never been a book. I'm going to do it." Because I'm not. This isn't something I'm going to start doing tomorrow. I'm giving myself a little breather, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
Excellent. Brian, if people want to check out your work, where's the best place to find you?
Sure. Well, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Brian R. Solomon. On Facebook, I have kind of an author Facebook page, which if you look up Brian Solomon Writer, that's me. That's where I update people on everything. My writing projects and things. And also on all those platforms, you can find the link to my separate author website, which I update regularly with appearances and things that are going to be happening. And of course, like we said, the podcast is Shut Up and Wrestle, which you can find on all podcast platforms: Spotify, Podcast Addict, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find them. You'll find Shut Up and Wrestle.
Brian, I'd love to have you back on when that book is going to drop, and we don't have to talk about wrestling next time.
Oh, you mean the superheroes book? Yeah, that'd be fun. That they want to they're targeting it for Father's Day 2023, which is a little less than a year from now, because they see it understandably as a big potential Father's Day present. So we're going to be we have a cover, and I sent the finished manuscript in, and we have photography. It hasn't been laid out yet or anything like that, so we still have work to be done, but the hardest part is done.
Brian, thanks so much.
You're welcome.